everyone to the Women Are Worthy Network. I have the one and only David Kessler. I mentioned, and I have to get back into this. The world is mourning. Everyone is mourning right now because of, what's going on with the virus, death, unemployment, the Black Lives Matter, you name it, the Asian community. Everyone's mourning something. What are you doing with that? What are you doing with that? You hear the conversations. For me personally, I'm going to keep it 100. I have not had a chance to mourn all the people that I was told have passed, because the minute I get that chance to mourn, I get another phone call, and it's been draining. It's just been draining. So what I decided to do was I decided to get the lead expert in this, right? And the lead expert is Mr. David Kessler. He's an expert when it comes to grief and when it comes to sorrow. So this is the person that we need to have. We want to thank Mr. David Kessler for being on the show. Woo!
I'm so glad to be with you.
So we're going to be talking about 5 stages of grief, but David also has a book. But I wanted to do this because someone I really love, she's been married for so many years and her husband passed, right? And what do you do with that? Everyone can tell you it's going to be okay, but their husbands are alive or they're not married. So I want to know from you, I want to go back to when we talked about it, 13 years old. How did you experience this? What happened to you for you to get into this field?
Sure. I grew up with a mother who was in and out of the hospital, and I just thought that's what parents did. They go to the hospital a lot. And then when I was 13 years old, she had to go get a treatment in a hospital in the big city a few hours away. And she was in the ICU. The rule was you had to be 14 years old. I was 13. Most of the nurses wouldn't let me up. A few snuck me up, but most wouldn't let me up. Spent a lot of time in that hospital lobby. We were also across the street at a hotel. One day in the hotel, people started yelling fire. Everyone ran out because there was a fire on the 18th floor. We all looked up at the flames coming out. Fire trucks pulled up, and then shooting began. It turned out that the shooting went on for 13 hours. It was one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. And we found out later it was racially motivated. I wasn't able to be there with my mother when she died. And back then, they even thought, families were an interruption of the healing process. And think about back in the 70s, wasn't able to be with my mom, shooting, racial issues. Sounds like today. I wish things had changed more, but all those issues are still happening today. And there was no one there to help me. I mean, someone told me to be strong, and that was the only grief advice I got. And in some weird ways, I grew up to be a person that could have helped me. So it changed the trajectory of my life. I turned into a grief specialist, and I really spent years learning how to help people and really learning from people in grief. They were my teachers. I got to work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the woman who did the 5 stages of grief, and I'll put them in the chat.
And I'm glad you're doing that, David, because here's the thing, like I said earlier, we were talking offline. I am so exhausted. I don't know about you, who's viewing the show. I'm freaking exhausted. It's like, I don't want to turn on the television. I don't want to answer the phone. When I get a phone call late at night or early in the morning, I'm like, okay, who died? And, we talked about George Floyd earlier, and we brought that in because that's also another form of grief. Okay, because we have all these things happening. What do you do with it? What do you do with it? Because I'm telling you, I'm now meditating. It's messing with my psyche. You mentioned earlier and I talked about the World Trade Center, because we're still recuperating. But we saw that on television. We saw what that was. But with the virus, you don't see it. You just, it's
Right.
something that, so can you
Well,
speak to that?
yeah. So one of the things that, I talk about is if you're in grief, you don't need to be fixed because you're not broken. People aren't broken. You don't need to fix them. They're in grief. And so in a lot of ways, I'm teaching people what their great grandparents knew. Our great grandparents knew how to be with the dying, how to be with people in grief. And it's so strange, we know how to do this. Here's my thing. I always tell people, you come from a long line of dead people. Every ancestor you have had has died. Your body knows how to do this. Society tells you you should move on, you should get over it, you should be strong, and it doesn't work that way. So I really got to all those years with Kubler-Ross see how this works. And I was so fortunate to learn from her. And we put in there, she gave us the 5 stages. And even after decades of doing this work and helping people, I wasn't prepared for the death of my 21-year-old son 5 years ago. So not
Wow.
only am I a grief expert, but I'm a bereaved parent. So I know what this feels like. And as you mentioned, there's so much going on in the world now. Let's break that down a bit. There's COVID. When we talk about things like September 11th, we all witnessed it. We
Mhm.
saw we saw how the planes flew into the building. If you missed it live, you saw it 1,000 times later.
Yes.
And COVID is this invisible virus that we don't see these 700,000 people dying from. And it's the one thing, like, think about it. Someone who has cancer, one, you'll see them a few years deteriorating. You know what cancer looks like. We're isolated from people with COVID. The other thing is, you don't like, no one ever says to someone, my mom died of cancer, and someone goes, oh, I don't believe in cancer. But people will say, my dad died of COVID, and someone might go, I don't know if I believe in that. So that stuff is crazy. I know someone, their mother died. They're in the car coming back from the funeral, and the driver says, I don't believe in COVID. And they're coming from the funeral. So, this concept that grief must be witnessed, we're not witnessing the grief of people whose loved one had died of COVID. Back to also grief being witnessed. When George Floyd died, it was the first time the world witnessed what was happening in the Black community. We saw it. We had heard about it, but people, as would go, well, oh, there's two sides to every story. There's this. Well, they kind of did something wrong. And it was no new news to the Black community, to African Americans in this country. But it was news for us to have to watch that. And I think for the first time, we began to witness a grief that had been there clearly for decades and decades. And so finally, that grief is beginning to get witnessed, just beginning. And, I think it's really something we don't get. A friend gave me a Black Lives T-shirt matters, and I have T-shirts for all kind of causes. I put my cancer T-shirt on. People are like, oh, yeah, good for you for wearing that cancer T-shirt. I put Alzheimer's T-shirt on. Good for you. I put the Black Lives T-shirt matter on, and I thought it was going to be like any other good works in the world. I got looks from people. I had people saying to me, all lives matter. I'm like, what? Why is this shirt controversial? Like this shirt, so it's shocking to me. And I apologize that it is shocking to me because it shouldn't be, and yet it is what's all around us that, someone like me who doesn't have black skin cannot see it. And
Well,
boy,
I'm
it's
sorry.
around. It's around.
But you know what it is too is in this, and I'm going to say this, and that gets on my nerves when people do that. I'm going to gets on my nerves because I'm not Jewish, but I made sure I'm educated to know about the Holocaust and things like that. So I have empathy for my brothers and sisters who are Jewish. So when when those days come around and the Passovers and stuff, I know what they all mean because because we're all brothers and sisters, I do my due diligence to educate myself. What's gone out of this society is empathy. We're not empathetic towards each other. So I do my due diligence to find out what happened at Tenement Square, what happened in, I think that's what I want to do because we have to first understand what we have gone through or our ancestors has gone through. Now we're all facing this deadly disease, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But what does that truly mean? Because I'm telling you, Dave, I'm freaking so angry about someone's death like 15 years ago. They passed, and what I did was, okay, I got to focus. I cried a little bit, focus, got to keep working, got to keep doing what I'm doing. And now, because of the circumstances that we're in now or last year, we were all closed in. We had to go back into our brains. We were by ourselves. So then we had to, okay, Judgment Day. Now we had to, things we didn't want to face, we had to face.
Right. And so I think that's been a wake up call. Many people, just like you said, were in the pandemic and they thought they were alone or they thought they were isolated, and they found out they had a companion, and the companion's name was grief, and it was coming up for people. So let's walk through those stages.
Please.
Denial doesn't mean you don't believe they died. Denial is that feeling in you when you're going, I can't believe this is true. I can't believe I'm never going to see them again. Can this be real? Really? Am I never going to see them again? We have anger. You're furious. You're furious at the world. You're furious at yourself. Maybe even you're furious at the person who died. Maybe you're angry at God. When I tell people, I believe that God can understand our anger. Jesus got angry. I believe that that's part of the human process. And then there's bargaining. Bargaining's all the what if and if only, and I should have done it different, or I could have been a better friend. I could have been a more loving this. And then we have depression. And depression means sadness. It just means sadness. And then we have acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean it's okay or you're fine with it. Acceptance means you acknowledge the reality of it. You just
Wow.
acknowledge the reality of it. And first of all, they're not in order. I can have all those feelings in 1 hour. And when we talk about this idea of acceptance, I knew for me, it wasn't enough. It wasn't just enough to accept my son's death. I wanted more. And that, I believe, is the sixth stage, the stage of meaning. That's what I wrote the last book on, Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief. And because I wanted to find meaning, I didn't want to stop at that. I wanted his life to mean something, and go ahead.
What do you think when someone says, um, you'll get over it? What does that response mean to you?
You'll get over it. Well, easier said than done. And I don't like the word over it because I tell people my loved one was not a cold or a flu that I want to get over. I don't ever leave the dead behind. I'm bringing my son with me. I'm not getting over him. Now I'm going to move forward with him in my heart and in my soul, but I'm not leaving him behind or getting over him. So I think people need education on that.
I agree. So we mentioned that if Biden is watching the show and he were to give you $3 million, what would you do with it? And then if he said, hey, David, by the way, I like what you're doing. I need you to give me 2 things that you would like me to pass.
So, one, I would ask for more leave. You know, people need time off when a loved one dies. And not everyone is raised by mom and dad.
Right.
Sometimes it was grandma, sometimes it was someone else. So, whoever that person close to you is, we need some serious time off, and that really needs to be paid leave. I would also ask him to give us community resources, to have groups, to meet people where they are, to have more online things. I mean, I have online things, but we need more,
Mm-hmm.
so that would be very important to really help people see that grief is not an illness. And, if you decide you need therapy or need to see a counselor, that's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of being smart enough. And, not everyone can afford a counselor. Not everyone can get to a counselor. So we need to make sure people have access and they have resources that they can get.
Very good points. Because again, in this country, you have to be strong, or you'll hear someone in the family, I got to be strong for everyone else. Hi, Krista. We have to be strong. And I don't think we have to be strong. We just have to be, because what that does is that forces you to forget about the grief, forget about the sorrow, and
Right.
then you have to fake it till you make it. We can't do that anymore. And you mentioned something that was so true. I cannot, in corporate America, you get 3 days.
If,
3 days.
if you're
If you
lucky,
get, yes,
if
if you,
you're lucky.
right, 3 days. Because I remember I had 3 days, someone passed, and it practically took me 3 days to get to the place, okay, where I was. And it was how's everything? Because even on your job, God forbid if something happens to you, you're lucky if they're going to send your family a wreath. Okay, they're just looking to fill that. So for me, David, I'm trying to tell people to live your best life. Live every day like it's your last. Just enjoy your life. So a question I'd like to ask, if they could turn back the hand of time, what would you tell your son?
Ooh, what would I tell my son?
Mm-hmm.
He will never, ever be forgotten. I think the dead don't fully die as long as we remember them. Um, I would tell him I'm working hard to grieve fully and live fully. That's really the only 2 things we have to do is
Mm-hmm.
grieve fully and live fully. Some of us are good at the living part. We're busy living and ignoring the grief. Others of us are in so much grief we can't do the living. So, and I would probably ask him, what have you learned here that you can help me pass to everyone? I'd have more questions than I'd have things to tell him.
That is so true. So someone's watching right now. They had a phone call last week, and now they're at a moment where it's silence, because that's when it's really hard. When things are quiet and you have to come together with your thoughts. They were told someone passed, a spouse, and they're watching this show. What would you tell them?
I would tell them that the world is going to make you feel like you're crazy, but you are not crazy. This is what grief looks like. You know, when I told people I hit the 5 year mark with my son, I said that day was brutal. And they said, really? Still? And I said, yeah, this is what grief looks like. So when someone says to you, oh, you're so sad, if we can find it in us to go, yeah, sadness is what grief looks like. Anger is what grief looks like. Guilt is what grief looks like. You get grief brain. You can't think. You can't concentrate. All that's part of grief. And the truth is, my son, someone's spouse, someone's partner, someone's parent, someone's sibling isn't supposed to die and you be fine in a week. You're not supposed to be fine. Death is supposed to devastate our world. That's the reality of planet Earth. Death, a loved one dying, is one of the hardest things we're going through in our life. And, you know, many of us get more than others, and you just got to get some support. I have a free Facebook group for people. They can find it grief.com. I have an online group, Tender Hearts, that's about the price of um, getting pizza delivered, and I don't turn people away. Go to your local church. I tell people when your heat breaks, you try to get some support. When your car breaks, you try to get some support. When we're in trouble, our heart, our mind, we need to get our support for ourselves. It's okay to ask for help.
Well, here's the thing that we haven't covered, and this has affected me. So I gave my husband a dog for Father's Day, and then I took the dog back, not back to the place, but I said, "This is my dog," and his name was Tank. And everyone who knows me knows Tank. I mean, he was like a child. I couldn't believe it. I said, "I'm going to be one of those people." So I noticed some things was going on with him in his 6th year,
Hmm.
and we had to put him to sleep, and it was one of the hardest things ever. So you're trying to deal with it. People who don't know what you're going through is coming to you and saying, "Hey, where's your son? Where's this? Where's that?" And you're like, or your husband, and you're like, "He passed." And then it's almost like you're reliving that moment all over you again. So what do you say?
And
How?
you got to tell the story, right?
Right.
Well, first of all, I always tell people, when it comes to pets, the grief is real because the love is real.
Yes.
At the end of the day, grief is love. That's what grief is. And, I always tell people when they ask what to say, I always say the first question we have to ask is, does the moment deserve it? Does the moment deserve our story? I'll give you a good example. If I'm in the checkout line of the grocery store and there's 20 people behind me, and the grocery person says to me, "Hey, David, how are your kids?" I can't in that moment say, "Oh, one died."
Mm-hmm.
I go, "My kids are fine. At some point, I'll share more about that." Because I believe one is fine on earth and one
Right.
is fine in heaven. So you have to make sure the moment deserves it. And it's okay to say to people when they're like, "What happened?" to say, the details aren't helpful. Sometimes the details just aren't helpful. The point is, my loved one's gone. That's what's important. Thank you for your condolences.
So, how, as a family, did you guys cope with your son passing?
You know, just one day at a time. It was brutal. And I'll tell you, I literally went to a grief counselor. I went to a grief support group. Anyone who's had a child die, there's a wonderful organization called Compassionate Friends. They have groups all over the world, all over the US. I had to go to one of their groups and sit. I put my glasses on, took my contacts out, a baseball cap, and I had to sit in a group, and literally 4 feet away were my books. And I couldn't say,
Oh,
"That's me."
wow.
I couldn't be the grief expert. I had to be the father who had to bury a child. And so I had to be that person. So I had to do what everyone else does. One day at a time, it's helpful to talk about it. When your family and everyone says, "Quit talking about it, it's not helpful," we got to say, "I decide what's helpful in my grief. I decide." When people tell you to stop crying, I'm like, "Stop that. those are tears of love.
Mhm.
There's no reason to stop. If you've got 1,000 tears to cry, you can't stop at 500. No one's exempt from grief.
Right.
Grief is part of being, on planet Earth. Grief is part of being on planet Earth.